When you think about unchronological or non-linear stories, who immediately comes to mind? I think the obvious answers are Tarantino with Pulp Fiction, or Kill Bill, or Jackie Brown, or Christopher Nolan with his excellent Memento or Inception, also Park Chan-wook with The Handmaiden or Oldboy. I think that the choice to use a nonlinear story in your structure is one that can have a wide variety of functions for your story. For Tarantino, I find that it often just is a stylistic choice. For Christopher Nolan, oftentimes the decision to root a story in nonlinearity is directly a function for the plot of the story. Like in Memento, you can't separate the plot from the function of the order in which it's told. For Park Chan-wook, I think that he just uses nonlinear storytelling to maximize the dramatic effect of the beats in his story, as best seen in The Handmaiden or Oldboy. I think that there's a certain elegance and mastery to all of these films, though, which makes it kind of hard case studies when you're trying to learn how to tell an effective nonlinear story. But I think that there's a really amazing example that just came out into theaters, which is Weapons by Cregger. I think that this is the best place to start for a clear and precise articulation of why a nonlinear story might be a really good decision and how to tell it well without repeating information by, making events more dramatic, etc., etc. Reading the IMDb plot description for the film, it says, when all but one child from the same class mysteriously vanish on the same night at exactly the same time, a community is left questioning who or what is behind their disappearance. The film is directed by Cregger, and this is his sophomore feature, the follow-up to Barbarian from a couple years ago. I think already we can see a lot of the voice and the style coming through for this director. The structure between Barbarian and Weapons are pretty similar, actually, where there's a really strong establishing 30 or 40 minutes with one character, but then at that, 30-40 minute mark, it takes a specific pivot to follow a different character. And then those themes kind of start coalescing throughout the, second act until there's one big push into the final act. I think it's a really interesting structure that's pretty unique, but it usually pays off pretty well for me in something thematically resonant. Weapons begins following this school teacher who she was the one who had the class with all of the children who went missing, so the town is naturally, banding up against her, thinking that she was involved in the children's now disappearance. So for a solid 30 minutes or so, we do follow her character throughout the course of a couple of days until we get a bold chapter marker with the name Archer that comes up, and then we cut back in time to follow a different character who is one of the upset parents. One reason that I think this movie is a really easy example to study is because it has these clear dividers throughout the film of just a bold black screen with a name, which is essentially just a chapter divider. The film takes its time in combing back through some scenes that we have already seen before, but what I really love about the film is that in each of the chapters, when it's going back through one of the same scenes, it makes sure to be specific on which character's perspective is actually showing from that scene. And the context and the actual actions of the scenes that we go through are different each time. There's not a moment where we actually see the same portion of the scene again. And that's something that I want to directly compare to Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown, because I think that movie is one of the worst examples of a nonlinear story from a high-level director, at least, because especially in the briefcase pass-off scene, there are a lot of moments in that movie where the exact same information is being repeated from different perspectives. There are a lot of times where we're not actually getting anything new, and it just comes off as a stylistic choice to keep showing it, and it just becomes a little bit indulgent, I guess. Not necessarily in a bad way, but not in a productive way for the story that I really love. So I think that something to pay attention to in this movie is how the scenes are fragmented, and we start putting together the larger pieces of the puzzle for each scene as we go and see them from each character's perspective. I think that there are really good setups and payoffs set in this way too, where you'll just see a character doing something in the background. You're like, what was that? And then when we come back to the scene from someone else's perspective, it's a sort of payoff and a little dopamine hit of like, oh, here we are. We get to see this piece of the puzzle now. I think that it's a natural way to build momentum in your story, and I really like how it's all divided divided up. And again, to reiterate, it's very important that this film does not repeat information. Every scene and every perspective told is well layered to always be offering something new. One big point I want to draw is how the series of events with the police officer is told through this story. This officer's name is Paul, and we first meet him when the school teacher, Justine, sees him through a chain link fence, and she kind of has a moment where she's like, okay, yeah, I want to meet up with this guy again. They have a past. So the introductory scene for him is one at a bar where they're catching up, getting to know each other, and the way his character presented is getting you to empathize with him and like him right off the bat. I think that it does a really good job of getting you on his side early on, and it is not until later in the film when it cuts to his perspective, a chapter for Paul, when you start getting broader context for some of the dysfunctional sides of his life, and the way in which he is sweet to her in the bar and things like that kind of goes deeper, and it keeps an authenticity and a quaintness to those earlier scenes with Justine, but then they become contextualized later on within the film without ever having to repeat those same scenes. So I think that it's an effective way to get you to buy into a character, but then effectively show their ghost or their secrets later on in the film. This sort of layering of which information to pace out at which time is something that Park Chan-wook does incredibly. I mean, the conclusion of Oldboy would not be iconic if it weren't laid out in the order that it is. Something that's interesting is that The Handmaiden, I think, is a masterpiece for how it orders the information that it gives you. The director's cut of that film, the extended cut, is one which reorders some of the scenes in the film and adds more scenes. And I think that that director's cut is infinitely weaker than the theatrical cut because it takes away a lot of the dramatic gusto that was given to the film because of the order in which they paced it. So I would never recommend watching the extended cut of that movie unless you wanted to do a side-by-side viewing to see how the ordering of events can really change the impact of a film. I think that the movie does a really good job of not being too rigid about its chapter dividers also. They all flow into each other really nicely and have good transitions from one to another, but the film also understands that sometimes it just needs to break out of one character's perspective, and essentially the baton is passed from one character to another within the same chapter so that you get a broader context for some things going on. And eventually the movie just kind of takes a detour into what is essentially the third act, and it kind of drops the chapter all together because the perspectives were already set up and now it's just time to pay everything off. So I think that having different perspectives or having these different non-linear elements are really good, especially for the first and second acts of your story, to lead up to a powerful conclusion. I really enjoyed the movie overall. I think one of the things it did with structuring its information was in the prologue for the movie, before the first character perspective chapter begins, it decides to lay out the entire concept for the movie, which is not normally how information is parsed out in a horror movie. It just kind of lays out with some voiceover narration what the concept of the film is, which is essentially everything that you would have seen from any of the marketing of the movie if you watched the trailers. And then from there, the rest of the movie is just watching the characters deal with the consequences of this situation. I think that allowing the film to get that concept establishment out of the way was a really smart decision because it allows the rest of the movie to be very character focused. Normally you run into some pretty flat characters in horror movies sometimes because most of the movie is the characters just reacting to the concept and them trying to discover with you, with the audience, what is even going on. And obviously there's still some mystery that is unwound throughout this movie, but I think that the movie is far less concerned at first with the concept itself versus what the characters are feeling about the concept. So even that is something that, with the information being ordered in the way it was, I felt that it gave a lot of agency to the characters to shine, and I think that that's a big reason why this movie feels like a horror classic already, is because it just has such great pacing and character work. I like this movie a lot. I think it's better than Barbarian. I think that the writing is stronger, the character work is stronger, But in the same way, I think that it has a lot of strong themes and ideas that come through, which is what I really liked about Barbarian. I felt like there was a takeaway from the movie that was very meaty. I really like how some of the imagery is used in this movie to kind of probe images in your mind that will get you thinking about what the film might be saying. Specifically, the dream sequence section in Archer's chapter, I found to be really powerful. There's one image of a gun that is levitating over a house in his chapter, and it's a pretty ambiguous image that comes up in the film, but I found it really powerful with how it just had the timestamp that all the children ran away kind of projected onto the barrel of the gun. It got me thinking a lot about just the repression of the child and how maybe it could be talking about how this is the sort of situation that leads to someone who might become a school shooter, or this is the sort of situation that leads to just manipulation and what could lead someone to actually use violence against another character, which I think is something we see with Archer. Obviously, the idea of weaponizing things is something that comes throughout the movie overall, but I don't know. There are a lot of places that my mind went just from seeing that image, and I think that it was pretty effective in placing it early on before it contextualizes the concept a lot more. And yeah, I think it was just a really good placement for that imagery, and overall I think that it offers a lot up to you in the viewing. So yeah, I don't know, I got just kind of yapping about the movie here, but I really liked it overall, and the character work is strong, all of the directing and writing is strong, the soundtrack is good, and yeah, I would recommend it. If you want to hear me talk a little bit about his other movie, Barbarian, you can check it out right here. But yeah, until next time, I'll see y'all later, guys.